Yes. Yep. Yeah, we'll be going through, we'll be going through the rest of psychological disorders today. And then Wednesday, we'll talk about therapies.
Dan,
Yes.
do you expect us to know stuff like the cycles and of mania and depression? So different emotional, cognitive, physical characteristics.
It would be a good idea. I'm not sure if that's on the exam or not, but I would say it's pretty likely to be, because it's one of the more common and very disturbing psychological disorders. Yeah. The most common of the disorders that you'll encounter in general are the mood disorders. Somewhere between, I think it's somewhere between 15 and 25% of people will have a mood disorder at some point in their life. And the mood disorders include major depressive disorder, which is also known as unipolar depression, bipolar disorder, which used to be called manic depressive illness, and that's it, right? Those are the mood disorders. Yeah. And probably the second most common would be the anxiety disorders. And I don't think PTSD is, I don't think it's classed as a mood disorder, but it might be. It's not in the DSM-4. It's classed separately in the DSM-4. But that's going to be, PTSD is and is going to continue to be a huge problem in combat veterans coming back from the war in Iraq. Yep.
The dimensions, 5 dimensions of the DSM, that are simple. Axis 1, 2, 3, and 5.
So the axis of, probably that won't be so important. The 5-axis, the axial, what's called the multi-axial system in the DSM. And the only real benefit to the multi-axial system is that it gets clinicians to think more broadly about a patient's experience, rather than focusing only on the clinical psychological issues, but also the medical issues and general life functioning and that kind of thing. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. So we talked last time a little bit about the medical model of, applying the medical model to psychological disorders, implying that we have this ability to classify symptoms into a diagnosis, the ability to understand what kinds of treatments work well for that set of symptoms, which is classed into the diagnosis. And then ultimately, we would want to use the medical model to help produce a cure for the disorders. There really are very few psychological disorders, if any. I can't really think of any that have what we might consider a cure. Mostly at this point, we're in the treatment modality. But in order to sort of come up with a cure, one of the things we have to do is find out what the cause of the disorders is. And one of the reasons that it's so difficult to develop cures for psychological disorders is because they don't exist just in one area of your life. The cause for them is so complex that it's really difficult to really find a cure. And the reason that we think about this as a complex cause is that when we look at the prevalence of disorders, we can't say that everything is caused, for example, by your biology. So we can't say that if you have the genetic predisposition, let's say, to develop schizophrenia, that is, you've got a parent with schizophrenia or a sibling with schizophrenia or a child with schizophrenia, we can't say that you're definitely going to develop schizophrenia. Because in addition to biology, the development of schizophrenia is going to involve social aspects. So pressures exerted by society, peer pressure in adolescence, for example, the roles that we take on in society and the expectations that we're given because of those roles, right? And then in addition to that, some people deal better with those social roles and expectations. That is, they have better coping mechanisms. So the psychological aspects, how they subjectively experience stress. Some people get really stressed out by things and other people are relatively calm, right? Some people have different ways of learning how to respond to these things. And so all three of these, this is considered what's known as the biopsychosocial model, because we start out with the idea that, yes, there are some biological underpinnings for a lot of these disorders. We know, for example, that schizophrenia has a high genetic component. Your genetics is a big part of whether you're going to develop schizophrenia or not. But we also know from studies of twins that, you've got one twin that'll develop schizophrenia, one twin that doesn't. So what's the difference? The rest of that difference is environment. So what is it about the environment or about the individual that's going to affect how they develop schizophrenia? The second most common genetically predisposed disorder is bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder has just about as high of a genetic predisposition as does schizophrenia. So this brings up a lot of difficult questions. So one of the things that we were talking about in abnormal psychology, we read a memoir by a psychiatrist named Kay Redfield Jamison called An Unquiet Mind. And in this memoir, one of the things she really talks about is, should she have children? Is it fair for her to have a child knowing that she has this genetic possibility of passing this disorder onto her child? The way that her parents, passed this genetic predisposition onto her. And so it makes it really difficult for her to, to consider what are the implications of that. Doesn't mean that her child is definitely going to develop bipolar disorder, but the likelihood is increased because of the genetic predisposition. So I just want to give you a sense of how complex these causes are, and how little we really understand about the causes of these disorders. So finding a cure is going to be really difficult, because you need that cause, you need something really profoundly powerful in a causal relationship in order to treat it in a curative way. So what we're going to do today mostly is go through some of the specific disorders and talk a little bit about each of these disorders. As I said, the mood disorders and anxiety disorders are going to be the two that you're most likely to run into in other people or in yourself. And then the dissociative, disorders and schizophrenia are relatively rare, about 1% of people. I think I might not even talk about dissociative disorders today. We'll see if I have time. And so about 1% of people will develop either a dissociative disorder or a schizophrenia disorder. And then personality disorders are quite a bit more common, but I'm not sure how much we're going to talk about those today. We'll see how far we get. Are there any other disorders that you're interested in that I don't have listed here? Eating disorders? Did you want me to talk about that? I can.
Discuss pervasive disorder at all?
No, no.
So if you had to put an eating disorder as an umbrella, which would you put it under?
It is its own separate classification in the DSM. It has it shares some characteristics with obsessive compulsive disorder. It also shares some characteristics with dissociative disorder, and it has some. It has a little bit of an overlap with the anxiety disorders. So it really kind of fits. It's sort of multi-layered. It's a very complex disorder. Yeah.
Where does Asperger's fall?
Asperger's is in what are called the pervasive developmental disorders. Asperger's is a milder form of autism. It's when we talk about autism, we don't talk about just autism. We call it
I'm doing my final project.
autistic spectrum disorders, meaning that somebody isn't just autistic or not autistic. There are ranges of autism, and over here, a very serious form of autism, and then at the other end of the spectrum is a relatively mild form of autism, Asperger's. If we have time today, I can play a little video clip of a couple people with Asperger's. Give you a sense of that. What's that? Yeah.
If you're really interested in that, read The Elephant in the Playroom. Where's my book? It's by Denise Brody, B-R-O-D-E-Y. And it's an amazing book. It talks a lot about the spectrum and all of that. So.
Yeah. Chris is doing her final project in Abnormal on pervasive developmental disorders. Yeah. Mental retardation is also one of the pervasive developmental disorders, and Down syndrome is considered one of them too. Yeah.
And somehow, what is it? What the technical name for it? They're overly sensitive to their environment. That falls into it.
Any others you want me to talk about here? See if I might pull out personality disorders and substitute eating disorders. Talk to you a little bit about that. Okay, so let's talk first about mood disorders again, because they're going to be among the most common of the disorders. Yeah.
Sorry, can I ask you one question?
Sure.
Right before, but it's just regard to the personality disorders.
Yeah.
How old how long has that been around and tossed around?
The personality disorders really have been around since Freud started psychoanalysis.
Okay.
The official classification, I don't know what version of the DSM they appeared in. There's a controversial diagnosis called borderline personality disorder. And I know that this has been around since the 1960s, 1970s, but I don't know. I think since the 70s. But I don't know when the diagnosis first started being developed for the personality disorders. I'm just not.
What is the point of calling someone's personality a disorder?
Okay. This is.
Back in the old day, when you said I don't like you, and some said I don't like you either.
Yeah. Well, let's get to that when we get to personality disorders. Since you're interested, I'll go through that. Yeah. Yeah, we might have to cut out something else, but we'll see what happens. Any other disorders you want to go through in any more detail?
Will you be talking about phobias?
I hadn't planned to, although they're part of the anxiety disorders, so I may actually have that covered, but I'll see if I can't do that, yeah. Anything else? Phobias. Okay, so the mood disorders, there's a term for feeling sad, and it's called dysthymia. When you feel sad, feeling sad is normal. Everybody will feel sad at some point. Feeling sad becomes a problem when it goes on and on and on and on, or it becomes extremely intense and starts to have effects on your body and your social functioning and your occupational functioning, your interpersonal functioning. So there's a term for long-term dysthymia, which is called dysthymic disorder, which requires that you have this long-term sad feeling for 2 years or more. Most of what we think of when we talk about mood disorders is major depressive disorder. And I gave you the symptoms. I gave you a slide with all the symptoms for a major depressive episode. And the major depressive disorder requires that you have that major depressive episode at least once in your life. And if you have multiple major depressive episodes, it requires that there be at least 2 months in between episodes. Okay? So if you have a major depressive episode and then a month later you have another one, and a month later you have another one, that's all considered one major depressive episode. Okay? Whoops, what happened there? Women are about twice as likely to be diagnosed with a major depressive episode or major depression as men are. It's unclear whether that's actually a diagnostic reality, that is that twice as many women have the disorder, or whether it's an artifact of what we've established, which is men in general tend to seek help less for disorders. So it may be that fewer men are going to be diagnosed rather than that there is actually a bigger percentage of women who have the disorder. The primary feature of major depressive episode is a feeling of worthlessness. And it's hard to describe this. It's a feeling like, I don't know why I bother going on. Nobody will care if I'm not here. My life really doesn't have any point, any meaning, any worth. I don't really contribute anything to other people's lives. This is more than just being sad. This is a feeling of really emptiness, ego disintegration and emptiness. That your sense of self is so degraded that you really don't have any sense of meaning and worth. The other common feature that we see in people with depression are eating and sleeping disruptions. So, and that'll be either people stop eating, they don't eat enough, or they eat too much. And similarly with sleep, they can have insomnia, they don't sleep enough, they can't sleep enough, or what's called hypersomnia, which is basically that they sleep too much, or oftentimes will sleep all the time. One of the other key features is things that people used to think were really fun aren't fun anymore. Things that people used to really enjoy doing, they're just not enjoyable anymore. I really enjoy going out with my friends, but I just don't have the energy anymore to go out with my friends. I don't care so much now about roasting coffee. I'll just buy Starbucks, or I'll just go down to Dunkin' Donuts. And if you like coffee as much as I do, that would be a huge loss. Okay? Suicidal thoughts, that is thinking about suicide, thinking about death, planning suicide even worse, or actually attempting suicide is another of the important symptoms of major depressive disorder. Now, the interesting thing about suicide is that women are much more likely to attempt suicide. I think their attempts are about 3 times men. Do you remember if that's right, Chris? Something like that. So they're more likely to attempt suicide, but men are more likely to succeed when they do attempt. That's an We're stubborn. That's an interesting question. Why is that? One of the thoughts about that is that, and it's documented by evidence, men tend to choose more violent and more likely to succeed methods, whereas women tend to choose less violent and less likely to succeed methods. Now, why women choose those less violent methods is unclear. One of the thoughts is that, based on the responses of women who have survived, is that they tend to choose methods that don't result in causing other people distress. That is, they tend to choose methods that aren't going to leave a big mess for someone to clean up, or isn't going to be, gory and bloody and awful, right? So, so there may be more, these people, even though they're so depressed and they're so wrapped up in their own suffering that they have to choose suicide, that it appears that they still have some thoughts about other people and the consequences of their suicide. So, there are a couple of blips in terms of suicidal behavior. One is in late adolescence. We tend to see an increase in the percentage of adolescents who attempt suicide. And then there's a decrease in middle life, and then another blip later in life when people are elderly. Other questions? Disorders? Symptoms? The other side of the coin from major depressive disorder is what's called mania. And mania is characterized by an excessive sense of impulsivity, people engaging in impulsive behaviors, oftentimes includes sexual promiscuity and feelings of grandiosity. So I feel like I'm the smartest person, or the best business person, or the best salesman. And this is a really incredibly consuming sense of grandiosity. It's not like, well, you know, I've got some awards and I feel like I'm a pretty good athlete or something. This is they are the best at everything, right? It's really hard to imagine.
Is that where, like, sorry, but in the novel or the memoir we were reading, is that like with her feeling of I'm just super productive. I'm just
Sure. That's okay. Spending sprees. People will spend a lot of money in a state of mania. They will go out and buy things. But they don't just buy a lot of different things. They might buy a lot of one thing because they might need to, instead of buying one CD, they need to buy the whole catalog of the company or all the artist's CDs. And so they'll spend, basically as much money as they have in these spending sprees or go into debt, worse than that. Now, if you at some point in your life have experienced mania and then experience depression, it's not two separate things anymore. Now it's a disorder called bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder requires an alternation of mania and depression, but it also could be one major depressive episode and one manic episode would qualify for diagnosis for bipolar disorder. But typically people with bipolar disorder will have alternations of mania and then deep depression. So you can probably imagine how disturbing it is to be, manic one week and then a week or two later be in the depths of depression and ready to kill yourself, right?
And is it a huge fluctuation of the two?
It depends on the.
Like you were the person you probably see like, wait a second, this last week you're all about a year, now you're all this like problem.
Oftentimes they don't have, the memories aren't compartmentalized. You remember when you were like that, yeah. Now, depends on how this depression and mania, what form it takes, is going to depend on, there's a couple of subtypes of bipolar disorder. Type 1 bipolar disorder, the main symptom is mania, okay? So you have the strongest, most intense symptom is mania. Then you have what's called dysthymia along with mania. So a relatively mild form of depression, okay? And that's relative. That doesn't mean that it's not severe, but it's relatively mild compared to the deep depression that's associated with major depressive disorder. Type 2 depression, its primary symptom is intense major depressive disorder with a milder form of mania, what's called hypomania, okay? So your spending sprees might mean you don't spend all the money in your account, but you go through quite a bit of it. You don't buy every color of that shoe, but you buy several pairs, right? So it's a difficult disorder to diagnose, and all of these disorders. Here's the deal: beware of what's called medical student syndrome. This is what happens when medical students start learning about disorders and they start learning about the diagnostic features of the disorders. All of a sudden you start seeing every disorder you study in yourself or in someone around you. So the information you're going to get from the textbook isn't sufficient for diagnosing any of these disorders. So yes, especially self-diagnosis. Yeah. So if you read these symptoms and you feel like you or someone you know may qualify, it's worthwhile talking to a professional, psychiatrist or a psychologist. Okay. Any other questions on the mood disorders? So, basic classification, major depressive disorder, major depressive episode, and mania. And so if you encounter an episode of mania at some point in your life, you're looking at bipolar disorder, and in bipolar disorder you have that alternation between the major depressive disorder and mania. You can have a single episode of mania. I think it's still classified under bipolar disorder. There's a couple of diagnoses, one for single episode and then one for recurrent. But that's more than you need to know for this class. Anxiety disorders. Probably the most, let's see, I think this would be the most common, especially in women, generalized anxiety disorder. Generalized anxiety disorder is sometimes referred to as what you might call free-floating anxiety. It's free-floating because you can't really attach it to any cause. It just kind of floats out there. You just feel kind of anxious and worried a lot of the time. You don't have any particular reason to be, but your autonomic nervous system is always kind of cranked up. Sympathetic system's going like crazy, right? About 2/3 of people that are diagnosed with GAD are women, so it's more common among women. And usually it starts to appear either in childhood or during adolescence. You'll see this commonly among the disorders. It's relatively common for these disorders to appear during adolescence. And one thought about that is that adolescence is a time of intense stress before you've really developed effective coping mechanisms for that stress. So you might have that biological predisposition, you go through adolescence, your body and your emotions and your psychology is under all this intense stress. You may not effectively be able to cope, and the disorders may emerge as a product of that. There's also an evolutionary explanation for why that occurs, which is that evolutionarily in our past, by the time you were in adolescence, you typically had reproduced, especially if these disorders emerge in late adolescence. So they may not have been weeded out sort of by genetic processes. Generalized anxiety disorder, even though you don't have an identifiable cause for your anxiety, it typically is associated with the perception that there are threats in your environment. Okay? So you tend to see your environment as somewhat threatening.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. And it may be a product of the overactivation of the autonomic nervous system, but you tend to be more vigilant. You're looking out for problems or things that are out of place or things that are unusual, and you'll pick up on those things right away. Yeah. And what can happen, what that can wind up leading to in interpersonal relationships is you may misinterpret individuals' behavior as threatening or disturbing more readily than you might if you didn't have generalized anxiety disorder. Yeah. Phobias. Phobias. So what do you think of when I say phobias?
Spiders.
Fear of spiders, right? Something, yeah, generally when someone is afraid, yeah. It could be for a reason, it could be an unidentifiable reason, yeah. When we have a particular reason for what we're afraid of, we call that a specific phobia. Okay? So I might be afraid of spiders. I might be afraid of blood or body parts. I might be afraid of heights, which is not uncommon. I might even be afraid of wind, or beards, oddly enough. Clowns. Fear of clowns is actually not that uncommon. You know, it's funny. I was reading a study in a British medical journal, and it had to do with fear of clowns. Not fear of clowns. It had to do with the experience of children in hospitals. And it's not uncommon for hospitals to bring clowns into the hospital ward for children that are chronically ill and spending a lot of time there. And the thought is, well, the clowns will come in and they'll entertain the children, everybody will be happy. And nobody had apparently ever bothered to survey the children about how they felt about the clowns. And it turns out that they are pretty universally hated among children in hospitals, which is a really strange, you know, like nobody ever thought that like children might not like the clowns. So yeah, it's interesting.
Do you think because they know why the clown's there and they go, I could give her that ass? Or
It could be, yeah. Or just, you know, who knows? Yeah, yeah. Or maybe, you know, it could be that, you know, maybe they think, well, this is an obvious attempt at manipulating my feelings, and I'm not going to go for it. Who knows?
With the actual illness they have?
It could be, yeah. Yeah, yeah. It could be an association, a learned association. Sure. Second type of phobia is known as social phobias. And social phobias are essentially about being afraid of being judged. So someone with a social phobia, for example, would have a really difficult time being a teacher, where I have to stand up in front of, you know, 30 or 40 people every day and talk about something I know about, right? Giving speeches is oftentimes a problem. Even just going out in public, you know, being in a public square or in a bus or something like that, you have this kind of just fear that people are watching you and judging you and thinking badly of you, right? And again, this is not just, yeah, I get on the bus and I'm a little bit anxious about the nerdy clothes that I have on. This is like, it's a consuming fear. And remember that with all these disorders, we don't really start talking about them as disorders until they start causing problems in occupational, social, or interpersonal functioning. So if my job is to be in front of people and talk in public, and I'm afraid of that, that's going to be a problem. If, on the other hand, I have a job that doesn't require me to do that much, and it's not interfering with my, you know, just going out and being social with people, it's not interfering with my interpersonal relations, it's probably not so much of a problem, right? So again, when we think about these disorders, we think not only about the symptoms, but also about the frequency that those symptoms occur and the intensity of those symptoms. How intense is it in terms of your experience? What's that? Frequency, intensity, and duration, how long it goes on for, yeah. A third type of the anxiety disorders is what's known as a panic disorder. Now, a lot of us have probably had panic attacks. I had one about 4 years ago, and it was when I started a new job and I was learning the job, and the job was I was teaching, and one of the parts of the job was I had to advise students about what classes to take. So at that job, the instructors, the faculty, were also academic advisors. Here we have separate academic advisors, which is nice because I don't have to worry about that. But so this is something I'd never done before, and it was like, the person who was training me was another faculty member, and she was whipping through the screens, and I was asking questions, and she's switching over and asking the students questions, and I just became all very overwhelming. So I decided to go home for lunch. Had my lunch, suddenly started to feel incredibly nauseous, headachy, and then started thinking, I got to get out of here. I can't stay here. I can't do this job. And I started thinking, well, it's a good thing that I haven't unpacked all my stuff yet, because now I can pack real easy and move somewhere else. Like, I don't know where I was going to go, you know. So, and I had this really overwhelming panic. And basically, I had to put myself to bed for about, I went to bed and I slept for about 3 hours, got up, still felt kind of anxious and not quite right. And I remember having to tell myself, okay, Dana, keep it together. It's like I was going to lose it, right? I was just going out of my mind. So that's a panic attack, right? Oftentimes you'll have increased heart rate, increased respiration. You'll feel like you're having a heart attack. You'll get that same kind of pain in your arm that you'll get with a heart attack. Having one panic attack is not a problem. When they start to recur, and more importantly, you start to be afraid of when the next panic attack is going to come, and that fear starts to consume your thoughts, right? That's what's gonna differentiate a panic disorder from a panic attack. It's that intense fear of having another attack. And that's what makes it worse. Usually the panic attack symptoms will peak within about 10 minutes, and then they'll gradually get less over time. So these things tend to come on really quickly and then fade away. But again, the issue with the panic disorder is having that overwhelming fear that you're going to have another attack and it's going to be worse and you'll die next time. Yeah.
I have panic attacks that just come on from nothing.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. You may not know what is triggering it, for example. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes they'll just come out of nowhere. Yeah. But again, having a panic attack is different from that intense fear in between the attacks that's going to cause disruptions in your functioning, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Generalized anxiety disorder have these, or phobias, like social phobias, have panic attacks that they go in public.
Yeah. This is called, this is the term you'll see, it's comorbid or comorbidity. And to mean something is comorbid when it occurs simultaneously. So you might, for example, have simultaneously generalized anxiety disorder, this free-floating anxiety, and a specific disorder. Okay. A specific phobia, I'm sorry. And so, so you might have this generalized anxiety, but then you have certain things that set you into a specific phobia. So comorbidity, the most common comorbid disorders are a mood disorder and an anxiety disorder, for example, or a substance use disorder and another psychological disorder like schizophrenia. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that I find it interesting because I'm diagnosed with the generalized anxiety disorder.
Okay.
I have a long substance abuse history.
Okay.
Several years of IV drug use. And
Yes. Yes.
And then later on in life, raging alcohol.
Sure. Sure.
And I don't know if I just didn't understand or know back then what it was, but as I've come far enough along to where I moved out of that place in my life where I had to self-medicate.
Yeah.
To where I'm more aware and I'm learning things. I've found that anxiety at times has triggered me to want to self-medicate.
Of course.
To get my body to level out because I'm in, and it sounds so simple, the generalized anxiety thing, but it's just this constant state of uptightness and inability. I mean, it can almost look like like you can't concentrate. You cannot sit down and sit through a program, and everything's got to be, organized. Everything's out of control. I just know it is, and everybody's looking at the house thinking, You know, and it can
Looks
look
fine to me, yeah.
it can look like OCD, and it can look like all
Sure.
these other things, but I have really, really struggled with, you know, and then after having the substance abuse history and going in and saying, I think I need some help here, and being treated like, you're a drug addict, we know you're in here, and basically being told, well, we know that you want a heavy dose tranquilizer, and I don't even know what I need or what I want, you know what I mean? I only know of a couple kinds of drugs, and I know
That's
those
terrible.
really well, and I
Yeah.
know, and you know, and I see that happen a lot with other
Sure.
girls that I know that are in, you know,
Sure.
recovery.
And are they going to general practice doctors or actual psychiatrists?
Well,
I think a psychiatrist would be able to see the difference,
exactly, and I
but general
think-
practice doctors sometimes can't.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
that's where I'm on my way to now. Because
Good.
you know, I didn't know until I read some of the stuff in the book. You know, I've struggled with these bad headaches that I first thought were migraines, and I was going in and again, they're thinking I want pain medication. I'm like, people, I'm losing my vision here. I can't see. I'm having a headache right now. But anyway, it's like all in here, and
Tension, yeah.
and finally they figured out, you know, you're having severe tension headaches. And
Yeah.
then as I am reading the book, you know, probably started a couple of years ago, where I started having this issue with excessive sweating. Thinking,
Mm-hmm.
what the hell? This is not attractive. What's going on? And it's so true. Like all these symptoms go together, and it's just like, well, what do you don't want to make a doctor's. Well, what do you need to be seen for? Well, excessive sweating. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You don't even know these things are symptoms.
Yeah. So one of the treatments, by the way, for tension headaches that's shown some efficacy is biofeedback. The same thing we did here in the lab is basically they hook up, instead of hooking up an EKG reading to monitor your heart rate, what they'll do is they'll hook up EMG electrodes to measure the tension in your muscles, and you actively work on reducing that tension and, you know, finding the mechanisms to relax that tension and let it drain out. And that's sometimes very useful, you know, because once you learn those techniques, when you feel that tension coming on, you use the same kinds of techniques to reduce it. Yeah. Now, you bring up an important point, is that oftentimes the disturbance that we feel psychologically can be medicated. You know, you happen to find a really effective way to undo this, and that was with you know, illegal drugs or even you know, prescription painkillers that may take away that, at least the feeling of it, in alcohol. And so what we see in, for example, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is high rates of alcoholism, and the thought is that that's a method of self-medicating for the disorder, and that's why we see oftentimes this comorbidity of substance use disorders with other psychological disorders. But what will oftentimes happen is once you've developed that substance use disorder, now it's difficult to disentangle that from the psychological disorder, because the substance use disorder then takes on a life of its own. So you can't just say, well, I'll substitute alcohol with benzodiazepines, because you'll still be craving the alcohol. It's got its own triggers. It's got its own consequences that are desirable. And even though you're taking benzodiazepines for the anxiety disorder, you still want the alcohol. Or you start substituting the addiction to the benzos, but that's less common, yeah.
I just wonder, talking about like mania, maybe depression disorder, and these kind of things that we treat with medication that we can get from prescriptions, and thinking how these are all disorders, but it seems like it would be best to try and address the problem without things like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's also a big difference between a general anxiety disorder like phobias, these things that you can identify and that they're very psychological, whereas it seems like major depressive disorder and mania are actually like something more biological. Perhaps?
Yeah. So what we'll see when we talk about therapies, what we'll see is that oftentimes medication is useful for undoing the symptoms of these disorders. But by itself, medication doesn't typically address the underlying causes, what we think of as the causes. And so when we look at the efficacy of medication, for example, for depression, we look at the efficacy of medication and psychotherapy, we see each is about the same, but when we combine them, then we get this synergistic effect that actually results in better outcomes. But as I said, we'll talk more about that when we talk about therapies. Yeah. Last of the anxiety disorders we'll talk about is obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's known as OCD. And OCD involves two primary symptoms. One is obsessions. And obsessions are an uncontrollable thoughts that just come into your mind without you being able to stop them. And so this obsessive kind of thinking is a very cognitive experience, but OCD also is characterized by compulsions, so behaviors that are uncontrollable. Now, here's the deal. What's important about OCD is that the people who are, and that makes it different from delusional behavior, delusional disorders, the people who are engaging in OCD behaviors and thinking are well aware that what they're thinking, what they're doing is very irrational and doesn't make any sense, and they don't want to do it. But if they don't do the behavior, they don't get rid of the anxiety, right? And the thoughts persist. This obsessional thinking persists until they can finally do it, until they can finally engage in the behavior, until they can finally complete the task that they have to complete. And what will happen commonly is the compulsions take the form of repetitive behaviors. So you have to do something a certain number of times. That's what's called a counting ritual. So you might have to check the locks and make sure you locked the door. But checking it once and going back to bed isn't going to do it. Every time you do it, you have to do it 5 times. Okay? And if you get interrupted in the 4th time, you have to start over and do it 5 times again. So as you can imagine, this can be incredibly time-consuming and incredibly disruptive to someone's functioning. It might be to the point where you can't get out of the house and go to work because you're involved in these rituals and they keep getting interrupted, and the obsessive thoughts keep you from concentrating on work. So this is a very serious disorder, and fortunately, though, we have some pretty good treatments for OCD. Why don't we take a break here? It's about noon. Come back at 10 after. I've got a brief video clip of OCD stuff, and then we'll pick up after that.
Did you see Oprah's special as called OCD Camp?
No, I don't believe I did.
I'm kind of wondering
Thank you.
how balanced it is.
Right.
I mean, it was really interesting to watch, but they use a lot of,
Well, you should know. You studied it, so.
well, they use a lot of flooding techniques and stuff like that, which I thought interesting.
Yeah, flooding works for some people. Generally, so what I'll do at this point, I'd like to show you a brief video clip of a couple of women who have OCD. And I like this clip because they're both quite articulate, and they articulate the experience of OCD really well. They've both been in therapy for quite some time, and so they have a good perspective on the disorder and a good perspective on overcoming it. What's that? Yeah. So let's see what you think about this. make sure the sound's up. Yep.
Obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder that affects about 1% of the population. The symptoms of this disorder include recurrent thoughts, repetitive, often ritualistic behaviors, and the presence of marked anxiety surrounding these thoughts and actions. Although most people experience some obsessions and compulsions, these behaviors are considered abnormal only when they cannot be controlled and when they significantly reduce the quality of a person's life. Laura and Marna are longtime friends who have both suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder since adolescence. Although both women live relatively normal lives, their disorder interferes in significant ways. For example, simple actions such as filing an important paper can set off a spiral of compulsive behaviors. These behaviors can become highly ritualized and can occupy an entire day.
When I was in school, I would walk down the halls and I would be looking at other people and I thought, they don't have this in their brain. They're not, I mean, it was just, they weren't obsessing. I was acutely aware that I was, different and agonizing, and I wanted to be like them for a minute, to have some relief.
I just thought I was completely weird. In high school, I would spend 4 to 5 minutes putting on mascara, and like each little lash. Why am I doing this? I would say to myself. This is weird. None of my other friends take this long to put on mascara. I had 2 major OCD things. And the major one would be like checking either paperwork, clothing tags, or zippers. The other one that I hate the most, that really, brings shame, inside of me or whatever, is the picking of the scabs, the obsessively picking and repicking the scabs. And that's the most painful for me. On a bad day with my OCD, I wouldn't be able to figure out what to wear. I would be running around, and then I'd be sweating a lot because I'd be getting nervous because I'm running late. And then I wouldn't be able to find the particular paperwork that I needed to take to an important meeting that day. Because what I'll do is I'll put it away, and then the urge, and you can feel it. It's almost like a surge that you have to. We've actually never talked about this particular aspect, but it's like a surge. And I gotta check. I gotta see is that other insurance paper behind there, and what's behind that, and what's behind that, and what's in the other little, how dividers in a portable file kind of thing. And so I just end up checking all of it. And in my worst days several years back, I would check. I have to cut the tags off my clothes because I'll check. Oh, made in Korea. Oh, and it's a large. And I know brand names for zippers because did I ever tell you about the zipper one? Yeah.
But you know all the tags.
Yalan, Y-A-L-O-N, the Yalan company. So things like that. Okay, but what I would do is I'd have to feel. See, right now I'm wanting to feel the ledge. I'd have to feel it and go, okay, there's a ledge. Okay, where's the ledge? There's a ledge. Okay, and this is all in my mind. And the one that's in my pillow, I would lift it up and down and up and down and up and down.
People with obsessive-compulsive disorder often become obsessed by unpleasant or inappropriate thoughts. As you will see in this segment, for example, they might think about harming someone they love, and when they are unable to purge this idea from their mind, they become highly distressed. Furthermore, they might feel driven to perform a ritualistic act, such as hand-washing or counting, in order to avert some perceived threat. As is typical of people with OCD, both Laura and Marna are keenly aware that their obsessions are irrational and counterproductive. Still, they have great difficulty controlling their obsessive thoughts and behaviors.
On a bad day, on one of my worst days, I was up all night, so 7 or 8 hours, trying to figure out what to wear. And I was aware that this was happening, and it was frustrating. It was sad, and I didn't know how I was going to get out of that. But I had to figure it out. So, but that's 7 or 8 hours, and then I was exhausted, and then I had to go to school. So, and I knew that it was going to affect my whole next day. But what do you do? I mean, I just couldn't figure it out. So that's 7 or 8 hours ruminating on that, and you had.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't quite 7 hours, but it was so.
4 hours.
I think one night it was about 10 or so, and I just felt compelled to look at all the tags on my shirts, and I'm sitting there looking, and I kept saying to myself, "Go to bed, Laura, go to bed." And instead I just would check the tags, and I finally, maybe about like 2:30 or so, like 4.5, 5 hours later, I just was like, oh, must go to bed, and finally made it. But I was so mad at myself, and it's embarrassing, and I think, normal people don't do this,
I try not to go grocery shopping anymore. I avoid it at all costs. Okay, so I'm going to the produce aisle, and I'm getting some celery. And which bunch do you take? And if there are people around, then it creates more anxiety. So I'm looking at each bunch, and I know, okay, that one's not going to do it. And so then I have to, I might pick it up. Okay, I might find a bunch that I like, pick it up, put it in the grocery cart, and walk down, and I know that's not the one that I want. So I'll just kind of strategically, okay, as soon as that customer goes down to the next aisle, I'll go back and get that other bunch that I thought, yeah, that's the better bunch. Sometimes I just have this compelling urge to step on the gas and just go. And then if a pedestrian's crossing the street, and I will have this compelling urge to run them over. And I've never done that, and I learned that if you get into a situation like that, you can just put the car in neutral, and that will help. And I have done that at times, because I just don't want to deal with the urge or the fear of actually running them over. I've been walking down the street with a friend and felt the urge to just push him into traffic, and so I thought, let's just go over on the other block, walk down the other street. So, and I don't think that I would ever do it, but I have the thought nevertheless, and it's disturbing.
During the 1990s, researchers made great strides in developing treatments for people with OCD. Today, a combination of behavior therapy and medications can reduce obsessive-compulsive symptoms in nearly 60% of those who suffer from this condition. In the final segment, Laura and Marna discuss some of the techniques they have learned in therapy, which help them cope with their OCD. They also discuss their hope for a future when they can be free from both obsessions and compulsions.
I get relief by stitching, doing cross stitch, and it's amazing, the transformation. I just pick up the needle, and it's as if my is being.
Uh-oh.
But it's very different. I get calm and peaceful.
Usually, if I wait, after about 15-20 minutes, especially like half hour, the urge is either gone or it's much less. I mean, literally, in the last couple weeks, I've been pregnant, I'm finally conquering this after like 8 years. Because I didn't start out doing that.
Now, she has told me at least 4 times that she's gone through this, you know, over the past 8 years. This is it. I've stopped the
Okay,
thinking.
but this is really it.
I
It's
know.
like an addiction. It's like, but isn't it similar to like alcohol addiction?
Absolutely.
I'm stopping drinking. I'm not going to have another drink, and the next day they go out and have beer. So, you know, but really, this is it.
Okay, we'll see.
All right.
Anyway, there is, you know, we're in a good mood today, but there are aspects to this that are so sad and so depressing. It doesn't stop on a bad day. You go from one thing to the next, and while you're doing the first thing, I'm aware that I'm going to have to deal with this next thing as soon as I can resolve this. So, because dealing with life, it's one thing after another.
So as you can imagine, OCD can be really disruptive for people's lives, yeah?
If someone like works out a lot and becomes like, or somebody that becomes like obsessive with weight loss, can it be like a form other than like repetitive type?
Yeah, it generally, OCD, you have to have both the obsessive thoughts, which typically the most common forms tend to be having to do with germs or contamination. And the obsessive behaviors generally occur in counting rituals, but they can occur in just a duration. They have to do something for a specific duration. Now, an individual, most commonly, if someone exercises excessively, that is, they exercise, more than most people would under any given condition. You know, if they're an athlete training for a triathlon, they're going to be doing a lot of exercise. But if they're just, if they're just going through daily life and they're exercising, say, 2-3 hours a day, generally that's more indicative of an eating disorder of the non-purging variety, but it could be, and we'll talk about that, we'll talk about eating disorders, but yeah, I'm sorry.
I guess like I was thinking about my dad because to me he's not an athlete. He's 62 years old and he like just got an elliptical machine and after like a week was doing 26 miles like once and just like wouldn't stop. He would like do 5 miles at once, get off, cool off, and then like go again. And it got to the point where he would do it so much and he ended up hurting himself and he was still doing it.
That's
and
a
then,
problem.
Like, he also like he has a lot of gun and he's just always cleaning them and he goes shooting a lot, but he'll clean them like 5 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
He just always plays it. I don't know if it's just because he's
Well, again, that could be someone who just enjoys doing those things, and exercise can itself be very reinforcing. If, however, it's causing him some problems in functioning, for example, he can't work, or he has trouble socializing, or people. Yeah, so people are having, people are saying, how come you're always, you don't talk to us anymore, that's a problem, yeah. Now, just compulsive behavior by itself doesn't qualify as OCD. You have to have the obsessive thinking too. But compulsive behavior problems can occur for a variety of reasons, and so it might be worthwhile talking to a professional about it, yeah.
That's kind of what I was going to ask, is they more like an acute sort of version of obsessive compulsive disorder? Because I have some people, members of my family, who are pretty compulsive about it.
Yeah, so is there an acute version versus a chronic version? I don't know how long it specifies that the behavior has to persist for. I don't remember.
Makes sense what you said about compulsive.
Yeah, because they can be reinforcing. So, people can get into those patterns of behavior. Yeah.
Wouldn't women's like choice to do cross-stitching, which says that, or doesn't that almost become a ritual?
So wouldn't the cross-stitching sort of become a ritual? It might. It could be, one of the compulsive behaviors. But again, you have to look at, how intense is it? Does it cause her problems in functioning, or does it actually help her? So you could say, if you have to go to a therapist twice a week, well, that's some sort of compulsive behavior. But if it's increasing her functionality and not reducing her quality of life, then we start saying, well, that's not a problem. It's a solution, right? As opposed to, for generalized anxiety disorder, someone who does substance abuse. And that then becomes its own problem, and that's not a functional solution, it's a dysfunctional solution, right? Yeah. Lauren? For OCD? It's generally a combination of medication and then psychotherapy, but we'll talk more about that when we talk about therapies. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. We probably won't finish up disorders today. We'll stretch it into Wednesday. PTSD is important to talk about because, as I said, as more and more soldiers are coming back from the Iraq War, and more soldiers are surviving things that soldiers wouldn't have in the past. This is an interesting phenomenon in this war. We're getting many more soldiers coming back with severe injuries, both physical and emotional, that otherwise would have died in the battlefield or in the hospital in the battlefield. But we've got much better medical treatments now that are keeping these soldiers alive. So we're starting to see a lot more problems with functionality when those soldiers are returning with their injuries, which is a good, it's a good thing that they're returning with their injuries, but we need to also have the infrastructure in place to help them take care of those problems when they come up. PTSD typically occurs in individuals who have been through some sort of extraordinarily traumatic event. And most commonly the triggers are natural disasters, combat situations, rape, and PTSD involves basically memories that come back to you, unwanted memories that'll come back in situations that they're not useful. Oftentimes extreme nightmares while someone's sleeping at night, and then a sense of anxiety, almost like a generalized anxiety disorder kind of anxiety, a sense of hypervigilance about their environment. Okay, and so PTSD, one of the main symptoms is basically insomnia. So people with PTSD will oftentimes have a real hard time sleeping. And as you can imagine, if you're not sleeping, that's going to cause problems with your work. It's going to cause problems with your social functioning. Your interpersonal functioning is going to be disrupted because of irritability. Oftentimes concentration problems. So people have trouble focusing and concentrating on a particular task. And it can become very intense and very consuming. And one of the ways that people will deal with this experience sometimes is through the idea of self-medication. So using alcohol, using marijuana, using drugs to try to control these symptoms, or at least to become unaware of them if they're happening. Okay. So high rates of alcoholism, for example, among PTSD, soldiers with PTSD that came back from Vietnam. Okay. Now, here's the deal. Not everybody who goes through combat, rape, or a terrorist incident or a natural disaster is going to have PTSD. So what's interesting is that some people not only don't develop PTSD, but they actually develop better functioning after the event. And so this is what my the advisor that I worked with at UBC likes to call post-traumatic stress reorder rather than disorder. And so what he did is he looked at survivors of the Holocaust. And so these are, Jewish individuals living, I think, in Canada and the United States. And he compared their functionality, their productivity, their life circumstances to age-matched Jews who hadn't been through the Holocaust. So basically, same age, same kinds of historical experiences, except the Holocaust is the main difference. And what he found is that the trauma survivors not only had a high level of resilience, they, most of them, the vast majority of them didn't develop PTSD symptoms. But in addition to that, he also found that they tended to have even better, they tended to have more optimistic outlooks, they tended to have better function in their lives, they tended to have a greater sense of meaning in their lives. And so, so these traumatic events aren't always just filled with PTSD. The results of them can actually be quite different. So it's important to notice that just because you have the same experience doesn't mean you're going to develop this disorder. Again, think of that biopsychosocial model. Some people have better psychological mechanisms for coping with that stress than others, right? So it's going to be very much on an individual basis who's going to develop PTSD and who isn't. Questions on that? On PTSD? One of the problems that soldiers are talking about coming back from Iraq is that if you're diagnosed with PTSD, you'll receive a medical discharge from the military. If you're diagnosed with something like a personality disorder, you don't. And so what's happening is they're getting a diagnosis of something other than PTSD when the symptoms are clearly in line with PTSD. So there's some problems in the systems of reintegrating soldiers from Iraq. In addition, a lot of the soldiers that are coming back from Iraq are National Guard units, and the National Guard units haven't historically had to deal with the reintegration issues of people who have been through extreme combat. You don't see the world the same anymore. You don't see yourself the same anymore. You don't see other people the same anymore. And National Guard units have historically been used in domestic situations, typically disasters, and they haven't had to face the kinds of things that the career military have in combat situations. And so they haven't developed the same kinds of programs to help soldiers reintegrate. But I think that's changing now as we're getting more and more of them back. But those programs are really important to try to take the person from the role of, the trained killer to becoming a citizen again, which is a whole different ball game. So don't underestimate the power of that experience for people. Okay. I'll just talk briefly about dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders, the main characteristic of a dissociative disorder is that the person feels somehow disassociated from themselves. Okay? So it may be that they feel dissociated from their body, but more likely they don't feel as if their mind is entirely them. You know, their mind all of a sudden becomes separate from them. Or maybe you have multiple minds all at once. And so dissociative disorders, as you can imagine, are really disruptive. Dissociative amnesia is a case where someone loses all memory for who they are. And what will sometimes happen is they'll lose memory of who they are in the process, and in the process they will travel to some other place and they won't know who they are. They may start an entirely new identity if they can't find out who they were before. Frequently what will happen is after a week or two they will recover the memory of who they are. But sometimes it'll go on and on. There's a case, for example, of a fellow from Olympia who was traveling to his mother's house in Canada, and he never got there. And he woke up on the sidewalk about 6 weeks later in Denver, didn't know who he was, where he was, how he had gotten there. And to my knowledge, still hasn't recovered that identity. And so essentially what he has to do now is he has to build his own new identity. You know, find out who he is, what he likes, you know, who his family was. He has to go meet his family. He was engaged. He had to come and meet his fiance, right? And, you know, they wound up getting back together, but there was no guarantee that, you know, he would have liked her in this new identity. So you have to appreciate how incredibly disruptive this is. Incredibly rare. Dissociative amnesia itself is rare. Fugue states, which is where someone travels in a dissociative amnesia, is even more rare than that. So I don't talk too much about these things. Dissociative identity disorder, even more rare than dissociative amnesia, is a condition where someone has multiple identities simultaneously. And what'll typically happen is you'll have this kind of consciousness of being one identity and then suddenly switch to another identity. And sometimes you have memories that cross over between the identities, but sometimes the memories are compartmentalized. So in one identity, you might have some experiences and form some memories that you can't recover in the other identity. So again, as you can imagine, that's going to be a real problem. Plus, the people who are talking to you, it's hard to imagine this because we have this continuous stream of consciousness that we call reality, right? And if you can possibly imagine that, you know, someone you're living with or married to will all of a sudden change into someone else without their control or without your control, that's going to be disruptive, and someone's going to have a hard time functioning. This is a controversial diagnosis because the diagnoses will occur oftentimes in sort of clusters. So in the 1970s, I think, there was a cluster of dissociative identity disorder diagnoses. And so mostly what's thought is, and it came from a relatively small number of psychiatrists, so it's thought that they were not necessarily all of them valid diagnoses, but it's a bizarre experience. And what it tells us is how the normal consciousness that we take for granted isn't necessarily reality. You know, these people have a very different reality. You know, we could, under any other kind of circumstances, might have a reality like theirs. So. It's also important to tell you that this is not schizophrenia. So you will hear sometimes someone on TV or in the newspaper, they'll say something like, you know, 1 minute I'm like one person and the next minute or 1 minute he's like one person, and the next minute he's like another. He's a very schizophrenic. No, schizophrenia is entirely different, and we'll talk about why that is later. But just be aware that in common language, people will confuse multiple personality disorder with schizophrenia. Okay. I think we have time for this. Let's talk about personality disorders. Antisocial personality disorder is probably one of the most common of the personality disorders, and also one of the most disturbing. Sometimes these people are called sociopaths. Sometimes they're called psychopaths. These are people who are usually men, although some women do have antisocial personality disorder. And the main feature is that they have an absolute lack of regret or conscience for the damage that they do in other people's lives. So these are oftentimes criminals. And they can be very impulsive. So they don't necessarily have control of their behaviors. So when they get angry, and they smash somebody in the head with a hammer, that's a very impulsive action. Most of us, when we stop being angry, will go, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry I did that." People with antisocial personality disorder go, "Deserved it," right? So it's an intense lack of any kind of conscience or regret. Hold on a second. There is some evidence that there may be a genetic predisposition for personality disorders, for antisocial personality disorder. We tend to see these same kinds of behaviors run in families, but the extent of it isn't very well known. Yeah, Lauren, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask one if it was genetic, but
Yeah.
it seems like most crime is done by men.
Uh-huh.
At least, I don't know what the statistics are, but why
Most violent crime.
Yeah, murder.
Property crimes, I think, are about equal, men and women. Yeah. Another personality disorder I'll tell you about. These are the two probably that psychologists know the most about, is borderline personality disorder. And you may have heard of this term, borderline. The borderline personality disorder is predominantly occurs in women, or is diagnosed in women. About 3/4 of those that are diagnosed are women, and almost inevitably those people will be suicidal at some point in life. One of the key characteristics of someone with borderline personality disorder is intense instability. And the instability happens in multiple domains. So for example, their interpersonal relationships may be very volatile, right? They'll love you intensely one minute and then they'll hate you intensely the next, right? What's that? Sounds like my ex-girlfriend, yes. Not going there. The emotions are very unstable. Again, intense fluctuations of emotion and real intense problems with impulse control. So they have a hard time controlling the impulse to lash out, for example, or even to lavish you with praise or gifts or something. What's that? And sometimes spending is involved with borderline personality disorder. I have another video clip for this, but we don't have time to run it today. Why don't we pick this up on Wednesday?